Welcome to part 2 of using Xbox 360 controllers in JavaScript applications. Now I'm assuming at this point that you've already taken part 1 of this course series, but if you haven't, you will probably want to do that first, as the content in this course builds upon the controller module that I pieced together in part 1. Now you're certainly still welcome to keep taking this course, but the material might not make much sense to you. Alright, now if you've watched my free video on the gamepad package, then you may remember that when I copied and ran the sample code, there were a couple of IDs that were logged with the device info, product ID, and vendor ID. We're going to do something with those IDs in just a moment, but first I'll uncomment the for loop in the test file here that's still hanging around, and then drop it in the init function on the controller module. Now when we run this, we should see that those IDs are logged to the console. Here you can see a vendor ID of 1118 and a product ID of 654. At this point, it's easy to tell that these identify the Xbox 360 controller, since that's really the only controller I have connected to my machine. Knowing now which IDs will identify a 360 controller, I can actually use them to filter out any devices that may be connected to my machine in the future to ensure my new package here will only process events from an Xbox 360 controller. Now before moving on, I should mention that I'm using a wireless 360 controller and have not used a wired controller with the gamepad package before, so if you are using a wired controller, your product ID may differ, and you'll want to use that moving forward instead of the 654 ID displayed here. Even though these IDs seem to be static and unlikely to change, I typically like to avoid hard-coding specific numbers like these in my code as much as I can, so I will actually place them in the config file I created in part 1 of this course series. This allows the module to be a little more flexible so that I can easily swap them out later if I need to, or if I want to take a different direction with the module altogether. At the top of the config.json file, I will add 2 new properties, product ID and vendor ID, and assign the respective values to them that were displayed in the console. In order to determine if an event was triggered by an Xbox 360 controller, I need to check the device ID passed to the event handlers against the device ID property on each device object returned by gamepad, whose product and vendor IDs match the values I just placed in the config. The first step here then is to query for the connected devices, so I will add a new function called getConnectedControllerIDs to handle this. I actually already have a block of code that queries and iterates over the connected devices, which is the for loop I moved over just a bit ago, so I'll snatch that up and drop it here in my new function. I personally don't think the L variable is very indicative as to what data it's holding, so I'm just going to rename that variable to count. And instead of logging each device to the console, I want to actually keep track of the connected controllers by pushing the device IDs of the controllers onto an array that will be returned from this function. I will need a new array variable, which I will just call controller IDs. Next, I'll remove the log statement and will assign the return device object from the deviceAtIndex to a variable called device. To ensure I'm only going to be adding Xbox 360 controller device IDs to my array, I can compare the product and vendor ID properties on the device object with the product and vendor IDs I just put in my config file. And then the final step is to just push the device ID onto the array. Now this function will actually accumulate and return the device IDs for all of the connected 360 controllers and not just for a single one. For my purposes, I don't need to distinguish between each of the connected controllers, so if you want to build a game or some type of application where you need to be able to tell if player 1 pressed a button versus player 2, for example, then you will need to refine this code a bit to account for those scenarios. As the module stands now, any connected 360 controller can trigger events through the same instance of an Xbox 360 controller object. Alright, now I actually need to do something with this new function, so I will set up another function that will take in a device ID as an argument, call the new getConnectedControllerIDs function, and then check to see if the device ID argument is in the returned array. The new function will be called isXbox360Controller, and it will store the results of getConnectedControllerIDs in a variable called ControllerIDs. In order to find the device ID passed into the function in the array of controller IDs, I'm going to utilize low-dash's find function here that I used in the first part of this course to help out by giving it the array of controller IDs to sift through. In the first part of this course series, we saw how to use the find function by passing in a predicate object for the search criteria. Another way to use this function is that instead of passing in an object literal, we can give it an anonymous function that takes each item in the array as an argument. The function then must perform the matching logic and return a boolean indicating whether or not a match has been found. If a match is found, then the find function stops iterating over the collection and returns the current item. If a match is not found, then the find function moves on to the next item in the collection and passes it to the anonymous function to see if it matches the criteria. This cycle continues until either a match is found or the whole collection has been analyzed, at which point undefined is returned, indicating that there is no matching item in the collection. Now, being that each item in the array is an integer, I'm just going to return the result of comparing the array ID to the device ID passed in. And since the name of my new function here indicates that a boolean will be returned, I don't need to do anything with the ID returned from find if a match was found. All I really care about is whether or not the find function returned undefined. You can do a straight comparison with the return value against undefined, or you can utilize another utility function that Lodash offers, which is called isUndefined. So to recap, we get an array of the connected Xbox 360 controller IDs, and then check to see if the device ID passed in is in that collection by ensuring the result of the find function is not undefined. If the result is undefined, then we know that the device ID passed in is for a type of controller that is not an Xbox 360 controller. The last step then is to wire this new function up to each of the event handlers so that the events are only processed if an Xbox 360 controller triggered them. I don't have any other types of controllers that I can connect to my system to ensure this code properly filters them out, but what I can do is make sure that my Xbox 360 controllers are still able to fire the events from the module. Based on the gamepad garbage that was just spewed out, I would assume everything still works properly, but just to be sure, I'll press a couple of buttons and move a couple of the access controls. Now at this point you may be thinking, well, yeah, that certainly works, but isn't that pretty inefficient to be looping through all of the connected devices, comparing the device and product IDs on each one, adding the appropriate device IDs to an array, which is also iterated over in a different function to find a matching device ID in another function on every single event fired from gamepad? And to that question, I would say, yes, it is extremely inefficient. I'm just laying the foundation at this point, and we'll come back to this to clean it up a little bit later, so just bear with me for a bit. Now something else I want to add to this controller module is a status indicator so that I can easily tell if there is at least one connected controller. Let's move on to the next lesson to see one way in which we can implement this.